as well, but he joins me now. Okay, sir, good to have you on. What exactly is the boiler flow and how does it work and what do my listeners need to do? Good morning.
Yeah, the first thing, morning, Nick. First thing, what it's not, we're not asking people to turn down their thermostats. We're not asking that. What we're asking people to do is turn down what's called the boiler flow temperature, which is a temperature set on the boiler itself. It's probably a knob that you've never twiddled. It is there behind often, or it was in the case of my boiler, behind the bit that you pull down. And I found that there was a switch there, which was on about 80 degrees. That's how it was put when it was installed. I moved it down to 60 degrees. That's the only change you make. The temperature in the house is the same. This is about the water when it reaches the radiator. So you can still set your radiator wherever you need it to be, or thermostat wherever you need it to be. Doing that alone can potentially save you hundreds of pounds. And there are a few other tips and tricks that are going into this energy campaign as well. And also, completely separately, £1 billion of money to help people green up their homes by putting in more insulation and the like, which will help hundreds of thousands of households as well.
And just lastly on this, so it doesn't make your shower or bath water colder either? No.
Not at all. It doesn't change it at all. What it stops the boiler from doing is constantly working at a boiler flow temperature higher than is required to heat your home or heat your water. And it just saves you money straight off the bat, but absolutely sort of no cost at all. It also, by the way, can help your boiler last for longer. So it turns out my education as well as a boiler engineer is merely starting.
Well, there we go. I'll be your apprentice and we'll get through it together. Your business secretary, while I have you on the line, a couple of other stories. We must look to China. I'm sure you're aware we're looking at some of the biggest protests in around 30 years, Secretary of State, since Tiananmen Square. Of course, they are a huge member of the global economy. What should we take from that? And it would appear the growing unrest and arrests being made, even if you video events, Secretary of State.
We're very concerned to see a journalist, I think a BBC journalist, picked up, beaten before being released. Whatever else happens, freedom of the press and freedom to report should be sacrosanct. And it's a reminder, actually, when I saw those protests over the weekend, I was thinking back, it's over a year now since we were last in lockdown. The way we got out of that was to, first of all, invent the vaccines, that brilliant Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine, then get it into everybody's arms. And of course, we were able to come out of lockdown. It's easy to forget that actually in China, they had not gone down that route. What they've done instead is to try to continue with the zero COVID lockdown approach. And obviously, that doesn't, we know from our own experience that was only a stopgap until we had those vaccines. So obviously the vaccination route is extremely important. Concerned and keeping a very close eye on what's happening there in China. But as I say, what's unacceptable, of course, is for journalists who should be fully entitled to cover things freely, should be caught up and involved and indeed arrested. And I know that that will be causing concern at the Foreign Office and elsewhere this morning.
Let's bring events back to the UK. There is a report that the armed forces could drive ambulances and fill frontline roles in hospitals under plans being drawn up if we have a crisis with the NHS this winter. Can you confirm that, Secretary of State?
No, I saw that story, but it's not actually entirely accurate, other than to say that the NHS always gets ready for any potential disruption. So it's not unusual to sort of game these things out. There's no plan at the moment to call in the army, as that story describes. What is important, though, is I think ideally to get this situation resolved. Nobody wants to see the NHS disrupted. I suspect least of all the nurses. That we have as a government followed the NHS pay review body, which gave nurses a pay rise of at least £1,400 this year, on top of a rise last year when many others were being frozen during COVID. I really hope that we're able to see a situation where this is resolved without industrial action.
Should the ban on onshore wind farms be lifted, Secretary of State?
Well, I've always said, the Prime Minister has said, Rishi Sunak, and many of us feel that where it does happen, that should happen with the consent of local people. So I don't think there's any disagreement about that. Offshore wind, which, by the way, a couple of weeks ago, I saw one day produced 54% of the entire country's energy requirements on a single day, is actually now the cheapest way to produce electricity. That's because you can build turbines, which are way bigger than you can build on land and do far more of them. So that's obviously a very big contribution. There is onshore power. There will be more onshore power in the future, but it needs to be done with consent of communities who perhaps benefit from some of that power rather than imposed all over the landscape, which I think is not likely to be something people want to see.
Yes, I mean, I remind you, you once described them as an eyesore on the hills. Why would you appear to, in part, be changing your mind?
That's because that was a partial quote from me at the time. They can be if they're not done properly, if they're not done considerately.
How do you do a wind farm considerately?
Well, one thing you can do.
They're pretty bloody big things with respect, Secretary of State.
Yeah. Well, one thing you can do is, remove them often from people's eye lines, so that you don't just have this sort of huge bank of them very visible. That's a question of placement. The other thing you can do, which makes them a lot more popular with local communities, is make sure the local community benefits from the power that they generate. And if there's a way of doing that, then that can help as well.
But you can't hide them, Secretary of State, can you? Well, they're very different.
Well, actually, placement on these things is very important. Communities often do say to me, it's being proposed here. If it was around over there, no one's going to be directly impacted with this. So yeah, sometimes it is a question of placement. As I say, I think you've got to bring communities along with you with things like this, with all forms of power generation, actually. I'm down in Suffolk here, where I'm very near to Sizewell. People see the jobs that it brings. People see the benefits in skills that it brings to the communities. So it is possible to make things which at first sight may not seem that popular as well. But as I say, we need a really good energy mix in this country of wind power, solar power, nuclear power. I'm going to be saying more about all of this later in the week. Today I'm focusing on the making sure we get the demand side of this right. In other words, this Eco Plus scheme to help thousands of homes with insulation, and these hints and tips on making sure your home's more efficient and your energy bill goes down.
Okay, last minute or so together. So there's not a rebellion within Tory ranks?
No, I see all sorts of things described as a rebellion. As soon as someone puts in an idea, it becomes a rebellion. I don't see it that way at all. As I say, I agree that we need to do these things with consent of local communities, which is actually essentially what all of us are saying.
All right, and lastly, now that he's stopped eating kangaroos' testicles, what does Mr. Hancock need to do when he gets back to the United Kingdom so he can get the whip restored?
Well, I'll leave that to the whips, but I would just say, it's often said, as you'll recall, that politics is showbiz for ugly people. And I think that Matt Hancock should be back in Parliament with the rest of us uglies, representing his constituents rather than in a jungle down under. Obviously, he's coming back now. I don't think he should have gone in the first place, and it'll be for the whips to decide what to do.
Grateful for your time today. Business Secretary Grant Shapps appearing here on LBC. We're at 2 minutes after 8. Let's get the latest news.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
Leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom, the armed forces could be drafted in to help the NHS during potential strikes this winter. Officials are drawing up contingency plans as more health workers consider joining nurses to take industrial action in the coming months. LBC's James Goodison has the latest from Westminster.
This supposed help from the armed forces comes from something called the MACA protocol. That is the Military Aid to Civil Authorities protocol. It could see armed forces doing things like driving ambulances, subbing in frontline roles and keeping key services running. It was used during the pandemic for various things, vaccines, testing, PPE delivery. It could be deployed once more this winter if and when industrial action takes place.
Protests against China's strict coronavirus restrictions have continued for a third night. The demonstrations have spread to major cities including Shanghai, Beijing and Wuhan. People are angry about the communist government's zero COVID policies, including mass testing, quarantines and snap lockdowns. The Business Secretary Grant Shapps has told Nick China hasn't prioritised vaccinations.
What they've done instead is to try to continue with the zero COVID lockdown approach, and obviously, that doesn't. We know from our own experience that was only a stopgap until we had those vaccines.
3 people have been arrested after the bodies of 2 babies were found at a home in South Wales. The 2 men and a woman were held following the discovery in Bridgend. LBC's Daniel Bevan is outside the house.
Officers were called here just before 8 p.m. on Saturday. Now there's a single police tent which is white and yellow outside in full view of the street, which officers in hazmat suits and in full uniform have been going in and out of all morning. Police say that the 3 suspects remain in custody.
Hundreds of thousands of homes could receive money from the government to help become more energy efficient. Ministers say the £1 billion programme is mainly aimed at supporting middle-income families who aren't eligible for help with things like loft and cavity wall insulation. Analysts say Amazon could see its tax bill increase by £29 million next year as a result of changes to business rates. In his autumn statement, the Chancellor Jeremy Hunt announced plans to revalue more than 500,000 retail properties across England and Wales. In the city, the FTSE 100 is reopening at 74.86 after closing up 20 points on Friday, and the pound buys $1.20 and €1.16. LBC weather: scattered showers continuing for southern and western areas. Some patchy fog in the east, elsewhere dry with some sunny spells and a high of 12 degrees. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Simon Conway.
Hello.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with Nick Ferrari at breakfast.
Good morning. 6 minutes after 8 on Monday, November the 28th. In cause of treatment and needing some help, the NHS, the Army possibly to rescue, and a strike. Also, of course, this report, and you'll hear from the journalist who's broken this story, the number of doctors lost as a result of Brexit, plus those waits in A&E. And what do we make of 2,000 bosses within the NHS? 2,000 of them making salaries or getting salaries in the 6-figure area. All those stories coming up in a moment. Plus, we'll come back to that debate about wind farms. You may recall Boris Johnson, former Prime Minister, speaking to me about them back in 2013.
Labour completely failed to plan ahead. They spent years dickering around, putting in huge numbers of wind farms, which really collectively wouldn't pull the skin off a rice pudding.
But now he's helping lead a revolt against Rishi Sunak to lift the ban to start building them again. And as he mentioned the Labour Party, what of Sir Keir Starmer's policy, possibly adding VAT to private schools? He addressed that with me earlier this year.
This is a political choice to take that money and switch it to our state schools so that children and young people in our state schools have the best chance they can have.
Nick Ferrari at breakfast. Call 0345 60 60 973. Text 84850. Nick Ferrari at breakfast on LBC.
Let's take a look at the state of our beloved NHS. Cracking story in journalistic terms on the front page of The Guardian, and we'll talk with that about their health policy editor, Dennis Campbell. It's about what the headline writer calls the price of Brexit, the number of European doctors who have left now as a result of Brexit. But Dennis Campbell, the health policy editor, joins us first to talk about this idea, Dennis, that I'm sure you've also been covering, that we might have armed forces personnel driving ambulances and even filling frontline roles. How likely is that in your view? Good morning, Dennis.
Good morning, Nick. I think it is. It must be likely, Nick, given the lack of staff across the NHS and what senior doctors are now calling the slow collapse of the NHS. I think it is highly likely that we'll see the armed forces involved. this would not be new or unique. Nick, we saw it during COVID. We saw it last summer in various parts of the NHS, the ambulance service being helped out by our army drivers. So I think it's quite likely indeed, and probably needed.
And there's a ballot, I understand, by ambulance workers. Is it later this week?
That's right. This week we'll see from the GMB union and also the Unison union. We'll probably get the results this week, bringing, surprise, surprise, even more public sector strikes, raising the prospect, Nick, of potentially coordinated strikes across the NHS when you've got all sorts of different types of health workers, not just the nurses, all striking potentially at the same time.
We're talking, as it is revealed now, there are sometimes 12-hour waits in A&E for some patients. Can this, presumably it's not just cash that solves this, is it, Dennis?
No, I wish it was as simple as the money tree. Really, that would make life very simple. The NHS in England alone, as you probably know, is short of over 130,000 staff. No area of care across the NHS, across urgent and emergency care, in routine care, in surgery, no one has enough staff to do the job. And scandalously, tragically, the evidence from senior doctors, from ambulance chiefs, is that people are dying regularly because the NHS can no longer do its job.
And so, known with these facts, what would you say a government should be doing, Dennis?
The workforce crisis is the number one priority. The workforce is the main thing. Steve Barker, the Health Secretary, says this is his main priority. But we had promised about 4 years ago now, Nick, that there would be a workforce plan for the NHS in England. It's been through different iterations. There's been countless promises from countless ministers, and we still haven't seen it. They need to get on with the job of producing a viable plan, agree to fund it, because let's not pretend it will cost money to have more doctors and more nurses. And one thing they could look at is why are we spending £6.2 billion a year on agency staff, on temporary staff, all sorts. Why not spend that money on hiring more doctors, becoming more self-reliant on homegrown staff?
And this plays very much into the front page exclusive you have in The Guardian today, the price of Brexit. Share with the listeners some of the figures you've worked out, Dennis.
So the Nuffield Trust are a very respected health think tank. They have looked at the number of doctors, European doctors, who were coming to work in Britain before and after Brexit happened in 2016. And they have found that basically the rate of increase has slowed down. There's been a drop-off in the number of European doctors coming to work in the NHS across the UK.